นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. Last week I was in Thailand at Ajahn Chah's monastery on the anniversary of his death, the 16th of January, and every year, if possible, go for that event and remember our teacher, and many thousands of other people also go and remember him, Sangha and laity. You might say it's an occasion just to recollect the qualities of Sangha, Sanghanusati. When people recollecting the qualities of Sangha, you're recollecting the qualities of good practice that bring about enlightenment for a disciple of the Buddha. So the practice that brings about insight, that liberates the mind from craving and attachment, and the practice of sila, morality, and practice of mindfulness, practice of insight, development of all kinds of good qualities, kindness, compassion, wisdom, and so on. When we go to Ajahn Chah's monastery, we're remembering his particular practice, personal practice, and a life well lived. And then remembering the obvious fact that he passed away like anyone else in that spot at that monastery, and we had a big funeral presided over by the King of Thailand. That was 32 years ago. And then we built a stupa to house his relics, which are still there. So many people find it skillful to go, brings up gratitude, appreciation for his life and teachings, helps people focus their mind back onto the teachings and the way of practice he left us. And it's a very meaningful place for many people, even people who have not known Ajahn Chah personally, but maybe they benefited from his teachings, the monasteries that have come about from his Sangha. And also the amazing thing that Luang Por Chah, or Ajahn Chah, he was one individual born in northeast Thailand and became a monk, went out into the forests of Thailand 100 years ago and learned to meditate, live as a Buddhist monk, dependent on alms, and developed the insight to free his mind from suffering and the causes of suffering, to understand the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught. And then he went back to that forest, Wat Bapong, where his monastery is, and began living there just by camping under a tree with absolutely no conveniences and facilities or accommodation or anything, just him and another monk or two. And then gradually a whole monastery built up around him, and then many branch monasteries and many students, monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen all over the world have gradually grown to have faith, respect and love for Ajahn Chah and his teachings. There's always quite a powerful reflection, and that's one of the reasons draws people back there over the years. There was one time near to the end of the life of the Buddha, and the Buddha was walking with Venerable Ananda, And you probably heard the story that the Buddha himself predicted or knew his own death was coming when he was about 80. He announced that this would happen 3 months before the event. He told his faithful fellow monk and assistant Venerable Ananda. And Ananda had the opportunity at that point to say, oh, well, you're such an amazing teacher with so many special powers, psychic powers, so much knowledge, so much ability. Couldn't you extend your life? As they say, is one of the abilities of a Buddha, can extend their life longer than they would normally live through the good karma, the sila, samadhi, panya, and all the baramis that the Buddha has developed, might be able to extend his life. But somebody has to invite the Buddha to do that. The Buddha himself has no more attachment to the world, no more karma to make, no more sense of self. So that would only come about if someone invited the Buddha. And unfortunately, Venerable Ananda didn't invite the Buddha to extend his life. And later on, the Sangha reprimanded Venerable Ananda for that. Said, well, you should have invited the Buddha. So they actually made him confess an offense against his training, say, well, I made a mistake, which he was very gracious and did. But he had that opportunity 3 months before the Buddha died to invite the Buddha to stay on, but he didn't. He was thinking perhaps more about the organization of and the events that were going to happen when the Buddha did finally, we say, enter parinibbana, which is the word we use when a Buddha dies. Enter nibbana. Body dies, the mind enters nibbana, is never born again. But Ananda knew that would be an amazing, momentous event in society, not just an amazing spiritual event, but just practically speaking, it would affect society because India at that time, huge parts of India, the people from the king down to the ordinary person, they had faith in the Buddha. So if the Buddha passed away, it would be a big thing for society, and there would be all kinds of organization and events to manage, and different issues would arise. He could see that. So he was discussing with the Buddha where the Buddha should enter parinibbana, meaning where should the Buddha die, because there would have to be a cremation, and kings and ministers and people would come from far and wide to join that. And the Buddha took him to where he did finally enter parinibbana, Kushinara, a place in India you can travel to and see where the Buddha passed away, entered parinibbana, where he was cremated, and they have a stupa there. But before it was decided that that would happen, Ananda, in his wisdom, said, well, this is the wrong place to die for a Buddha. Yes, it was a small little village. It seemed insignificant in the geography of India at the time, and it seemed like not the right place. Surely the Buddha should pass away at a big city where they could have a big funeral and a big event. That's the way Ananda was. He had great faith and love for the Buddha. He wasn't yet fully enlightened. Perhaps he still had some attachment to wholesome desire for a really good funeral, appropriate send-off for the Buddha. So he wanted the Buddha to die at a place where maybe near where the king lived, or where there would be a large population to arrange the funeral. But the Buddha said, no, I'm going to stay in, this will be where I pass away, this will be where you cremate me. Kushinara was just a small village. And Ananda was frustrated and surprised by that. But the Buddha said, but did you know that this is not the first place a Buddha has died? He pointed out that there have been Buddhas in the past, and that they've died in places such as this. Don't just go on the initial or outward appearance of the place being a small, apparently insignificant village. It actually has great spiritual significance already. It's just people have forgotten, they don't know. And sometimes the Buddha would talk about things in this way. Another time he said, there's not a single point on this earth that you could point to, or place on this earth that you could point to, that a person hasn't died before. And there was one time there was a religious seeker came to see the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "Where are you going? Where are you traveling to?" He said, "I'm trying to find a place where no one's died before, because I want to die in a really pure place." And the Buddha said, "There's no such place. Every part of the earth, somebody's died before at some point." Just pointing out that history is like that. We've had generations of humans and animals living in the world, spreading around the world, moving from place to place, and being born, living, dying, everywhere. Just because somewhere seems to be empty now, maybe previously there'd been humans habitating there. It may even have been a large city. Like if you go to India, you can see where the city of Rajgir was, which in its day was a big, powerful city, a center of government, and yet now it's just a small little village, very unimportant, insignificant. Big cities can disappear, or through war or through decline, economic decline, or changing conditions, changing government, and they can disappear or shrink down. And of course, people live and die everywhere. That's the way of things. When we bought or when the land was offered here for this monastery, one of the donors had a dream of an Aboriginal deva on the land doing a smoke ceremony, which is like a ceremony of welcoming. So we took that as a sign that spiritually the spirits, the beings that you can't see, maybe are welcoming Buddhists to come and live here, because they could tell we would come and live here and practice the Dhamma and live in a good way. Perhaps they were happy with that. And later, when we were making a building on the first land that was offered, the planning law of Australia requires you to do what we call a cultural heritage plan, where you check, you get an archaeologist or an expert in to see whether there has been any evidence of previous habitation on the land that you're going to build on. And sometimes, people dig and they find bones or artifacts. So a man came and helped us and did a report and researched. And eventually, as we were digging, we did find some artifacts. And all building had to stop until they'd been verified. And there were little pieces of stone that were used in stone tools that may have been thousands of years old. And they were a sign that Indigenous people of Australia had previously lived on this land. And we invited some of their elders to come and rebury them and do a little ceremony. And over the years, we've had one or two ceremonies and invited elders to come and see the land and give their approval, hopefully, of us living here and practicing here. That's just here in Australia where we are. And we just celebrated Australia Day, and often that brings up kind of questions about, well, who owns Australia, who was here first, and all the political issues, and people get quite emotional sometimes. But the fact is that, any bit of the world, there'll have been generations and generations of people living, being born, living, dying. And some come in through migration. Australia is particularly a country full of migrants from other places. But then there's also the indigenous people who have been here for maybe 50,000 years or more. Long time, being born, dying, and even in this forest where we're living now, the monks live in this forest. There's evidence that they were here thousands of years ago, living their life. And that's the same throughout the world, isn't it? In every continent of the world, there's evidence of many generations of people. And it sometimes highlights how we don't really own the land that we live on. We do nominally. We say nominally we assume ownership by buying and selling and declaring land to be in someone's name. But that's just superficial, because everyone is born and died, and you don't take the land with you when you die, do you? Which brings you back to, well, if you're living here temporarily, kind of borrowing the land, how do you want to live? And that's the question Buddhism is answering. How do you want to live on the piece of land that you're living in? With this body, as the Buddha said, 1 fathom long, meaning about 6 foot high. I know some people are shorter, some people are taller, but call it 6 foot because you have to use a kind of average term. So he said 1 fathom long, about 6 foot long, this body on the earth. How are you going to use this body and this mind that lives or dwells with the body to do good, to live in this world in this short period of time you've got? And that brings me back to both the Buddha himself, who chose to die at Kushinara, and then my teacher, Ajahn Chah, who chose to live and practice in the forest, which we call Bapong forest. And what Bapong, what means monastery. So the forest, monastery of Bapong, he chose to live and practice there, and then he died there. So he used his body to do a lot of good, to live a very fruitful life, not just for himself, but for the benefit of others, following the Buddhist teachings, just as the Buddha has, so following the example of the Buddha as a teacher. And now we're hoping or aiming to follow the example of Ajahn Chah and the Buddha here, and as Buddhist Sangha are anywhere in the world, and even Buddhist lay practitioners wherever you are, you can follow the example of teachers such as Ajahn Chah. Use your fathom-long body to do more good for yourself and others through your life, wherever you are. Whether you feel you own the property you're on, you may have a title deed and say, that's mine, my name, I signed the signature, I've got a contract, it's mine. Or you have already realized that you don't really own it, you just own it in name, but it's just 4 elements, bit of land that you happen to call your own, if you own it, in terms of society and the way society treats ownership. You may be able to say you own it. Maybe you rent it. Maybe you're in a rental property. Maybe you live in one of those countries where you might be in Singapore or somewhere where you're up in an apartment block, and then you have to say, well, who really owns it? If you own your apartment, but you're on the 20th floor, do you own all the way down, down to the ground? Or you may be in Australia, and apparently in Australia you only own the top 2 meters of the ground, and then other people can own the mining rights underneath you. I once lived with Lumpur Tui, who's still alive, and he's a very special monk, lives in northeast Thailand. And he has a huge forest, 1,000 acres or so, good forest right up in the corner of northeast Thailand, Nong Khai province near Laos. And when I was living there, he was making a legal agreement with the King of Thailand that this forest would never be bought or sold. It would always be used for Buddhist practice, for Buddhist Sangha to live and practice. Because being a Buddhist country with a Buddhist king, you can sometimes do things like that. So he drew up a legal agreement with lawyers who donated their time and expense. Lawyers are normally very expensive, but they donated that for this noble purpose, and the whole forest was made into a kind of Buddhist park and could never be bought and sold, and that included the mining rights. So he said, once upon a time, a satellite had gone over, and I think it was owned by the Americans, but who knows? Anyway, this satellite had discovered that underneath his monastery, which had a lot of rock in it, kind of granite and basalt and different kinds of rock in his large monastery, underneath there was some gold. So he thought, well, one day somebody's going to come along and maybe want to mine the gold here. And we don't want that because it's a place where Buddhist monks practice and become enlightened. So we can't have people just coming to mine the place and disturb it. So part of the agreement wasn't just that the surface forest and rocks and land would become Buddhist park that could never be bought or sold, but even underneath, the mining rights couldn't be sold. He understood very well that that land is still not self. You don't really own it, but he just wanted to do that as an act of kindness for the Buddhist community. And his forest is still there today, and it is a very beautiful, suitable place to practice. But wherever you live, whether you live on an apartment block up in the sky, a penthouse, or just an ordinary apartment, a big one, a little one, or you live in a house or on a rural property, or you're renting something from somebody, the sense of ownership, whatever title deed or contract you sign, it's just nominal, isn't it? In the end, the land is 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. You're born into it. Your consciousness enters the fetus at birth, conception. You're in your mother's womb. You have the egg, fertilized egg, and then consciousness enters that. And that's the 4 elements meeting with the element of consciousness. The Buddha even called consciousness as an element. And then you grow up, you're born, and you grow up, and you start claiming ownership of things. But when you meet the Buddhist teachings, maybe you start changing that attitude a bit, looking into it more closely. You realize ultimately you don't own these things. And that's one of the most important insights a human being can have. And it liberates the mind from greed, anger, delusion, and attachment, which is what we believe Ajahn Chah did. So even though Ajahn Chah lived a very good life on the land that was his monastery, and then died there, just as the Buddha lived in northern India and then died there, he didn't have any claim of ownership of the land or the things on the land. He knew very well this land is just, wherever it is, it's just 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and nobody owns them, ultimately speaking. They're what we call Paramat Sucha, the higher truth of just these 4 elements that cannot be owned, and they just exist, but they don't have an ownership, and they can't be controlled ultimately by anyone because they're impermanent, they're not self. Just as consciousness ultimately is not a self. But when we are born, because we're not trained in the Dhamma yet, we have this problem that we start taking ownership of things from day one. So when you're a little kid, you own your feelings, say. So you start crying when things go wrong, or you're hungry or lonely. When you're happy, you laugh. And both physical things and mental experiences, we start to take ownership through delusion. But the Buddha gave us this way of practice to help understand that better, to free ourselves from delusion. And so we have all the teachings we hear about of impermanence, suffering, and not self. These are the 3 characteristics, universal characteristics of existence that we apply to everything. And that's something to reflect on, isn't it? What do you really own? Do you really own anything in this world? And it's a kind of a question you can bring up every day, because it will hopefully help remove some of the suffering of ownership. In my body, for example, we all know what it's like to have illness, injury, pain, or fearing old age and fearing death. because we attach to the body as a self, whereas in fact it's not. So this is why the Buddha did say investigate not only the material things of this world to question whether you really do own them or not, and then question your own sense of ownership of your own body. And language is difficult because we do say my body, and it's convenient to say that. But is it really your body to own, to control, to possess? Or maybe it's actually not. And illness, injury, hunger, thirst, heat and cold, all exposes that, doesn't it? It's exposing the suffering that comes when you grasp at your body as self. Even more subtle and invisible is grasping at the mind, thoughts and feelings and emotions as self. But we do that all the time, don't we? My mood, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm worried, I'm bored, I'm excited, I'm elated. The I am that forms in thought and then grasps at memories and thoughts and feelings, emotions, is also a delusion that the Buddha said, investigate. You have to look at that and keep looking until you see through the delusion. So why do we remember Sangha like Ajahn Chah or remember the Buddha himself? Because we believe, in the beginning, all you can do is believe. You haven't yet experienced it for yourself, maybe, but you can believe that these are beings who have done that, seen through the delusion of self. And that's an amazing thing, that people can do that to the point where they liberate their mind from these delusions. They give up grasping at things that they don't really own and then experience the freedom. If you realize you don't own this body, then you don't suffer with it anymore. And it doesn't mean to say you don't look after it and feed it, but you know it's not really yours. When that insight is really established, they say that's the insight of a stream winner or stream enterer in Buddhism, a sotapanna. They just know that this body is subject to old age, sickness, and death. Nothing you can do about it. You just accept it. You know it. When you know something, it means you really understand it. It's not just a belief. It's something you know, that this body gets old, gets sick, will die. And you can accept that fact. You're at peace with that fact, and it brings you peace when you realize it. How much of our suffering in life comes when we don't accept the impermanence of the body. What is more subtle is the mind, because it is invisible and it manifests through thoughts and emotions and this subtle sense of conceit, I, what we call the I-making process. So the mind is like a little factory producing the sense of I, what we call conceit, views. That's how we know that we're here, because we believe things and we have views and opinions on things and we have conceit. I am better than you, I'm worse than you, I am like this, I'm like that, our opinions. That's how we know we exist, but it's an attachment. We haven't seen through it as a cause of suffering yet. If we had, we would have let go of all that I-making and identifying with thoughts and feelings and emotions as self. If you really knew that attachment to those things led to suffering, you wouldn't attach, would you? You'd know it's suffering. But you haven't done that yet. It's because we haven't done that, we keep having to investigate. And that's what the Buddha encouraged us to do. Ask the question, are you your thoughts? You can have very good thoughts as a human being, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the nature of thought is impermanent. And what's impermanent is, we say, unsatisfactory, because it doesn't last. Even the most superior, refined, pleasant thought you can have, the most useful bit of information you can think up, new theories to do with science or medicine or the creative arts, or all kinds of amazing theories and ideas people can have. but they're still subject to impermanence. They're unsatisfactory because they don't last. They arise, they pass away. And they're ultimately not self, even though at the time when you have a really good thought, you tend to say, this is my thought, and we feel very, if you're from England, I don't know what country, what language people use in different countries, but if you're from England, you say, I'm chuffed. I'm happy because I had a really good thought. It doesn't mean to say the thought isn't good. It may be a very valuable, useful thought, or a very productive, or a very peaceful, happy thought, but it's just a thought that arises and passes away. So if you attach too much to it, you'll suffer. You know, when your good thought turns into a not so good thought, already you're suffering, aren't you? Oh, I was so delighted, and I was so happy with myself. Had such good thoughts this morning, and then this afternoon already gone, and I'm back in the doldrums, and I'm depressed and unhappy, miserable, maybe. I hope not, but it happens, doesn't it? Your mood changes and your thoughts reflect that. So if you're identifying with each thought as self, you suffer when the change comes. Sometimes we try to get rid of thoughts, and that makes more trouble. And you see that in meditation. If people try meditating, they often start off with the idea, I don't want a single thought in mind. And of course, they usually think more thoughts than ever. As soon as they're trying to get rid of thoughts, then the more you try to get rid of something, the more you think about it, the more you build it up in your mind, the more you cling on, and the more you suffer. You might have noticed that with addictions. The more you want to get rid of your addiction, the more you're attaching to it. So the more you grasp at it and the worse it becomes. The Buddha's recommendation and his remedy for this will try to bring up mindfulness and insight. The mindfulness is just paying attention. It's a very neutral quality. It brings with it a neutral feeling and equanimity. You're just knowing your body, knowing your mind from moment to moment. So you train in mindfulness, such as when you watch the breath or recollect the Buddha or any other meditation technique, is helping you to be mindful. It brings with it this neutral feeling and this ability just to pay attention. Oh, there's this thought coming up. Your thought arises initially as a result of old karma. Because you've thought before, it will come up again. A lot of it is just habit and reacting in habitual ways to experience, pleasant, unpleasant, sometimes very simple, sometimes very complicated, but initial thought is always stimulated by what's gone before in the past, comes up again. But then what you do next, there's a bit of choice and flexibility there. So if you establish mindfulness, maybe you decide to abandon a thought that you can recognize as suffering. So when you have anger arise, but you are establishing or have established mindfulness, you can say, oh, this is suffering. Because angry thoughts bring with them an unpleasant feeling. They agitate the mind. And when you're mindful and you're paying attention with just a normal awareness, but unwavering and unruffled by those thoughts, you're seeing them as they are. Oh, anger is suffering. And so wisdom will tell you at that point, let it go. Why suffer? Why hold on to these angry thoughts? But if we're not very mindful, what we tend to do when the angry thought comes up is grasp hold of it and maybe develop it further. What we call mental proliferation. And we proliferate in anger and we suffer more. Think about all the bad things associated with whatever it is that makes us angry. Remember the bad things, find the faults, and develop it. Maybe even start fearing more of whatever it is we're angry with, more will come. We all know that when say you're angry with a person, before they've even said or done anything, you're already predicting that they're going to do something that will make you angry again, even though they haven't yet. It's just a prediction, but you run with that way of thinking, maybe partly on past experience, partly on a lack of mindfulness and a lack of self-control. And off you go into suffering. That's actually a natural process coming from delusion. And really, there's no self in that. If you could establish mindfulness and look into it more closely, you would recognize that it's not a self. But because of delusion and lack of mindfulness, lack of understanding, we create a self in that experience. So it's, I'm angry and I'm thinking of the person that makes me angry, and I'm assuming they're going to keep doing those things that make me angry. And even, without giving them a second chance, we're already prepared for them to make us angry and blaming them before they've even done anything, before they've walked in the room. We're already thinking the worst quite often. And so we create a self out of anger, for example, but the whole process is actually not self. It's just a process of wrong thinking based on unpleasant feeling, lack of mindfulness, wrong thinking, attaching and grasping to the wrong thinking. We make it more solid than it needs to be. And so we suffer. Because where there's a sense of self, we suffer. Just as we attach to the physical world and say, my land, my house, my thing, my possession, and suffer because of that, when things break or change or someone else comes along to take it away, we suffer. Mentally, we suffer as well. It's just more subtle and a little bit harder to pin down, which is why we need to do some meditation and see what's going on. But anyone who's tried some meditation will notice it, won't they? You'll notice how you form this sense of ownership around your thoughts and your emotions. And if it's a negative emotion, you suffer. Worry, fear, anxiety, anger, greed doesn't make you peaceful, doesn't make you a happy person. So you suffer until you establish more mindfulness and reflect, oh, this is suffering. And then you start unpicking the process, unpacking it and noticing what leads to what and how you grasp at the thought and create suffering. But if you stop grasping, you just let it be. With mindfulness, you can quickly bring that suffering to an end and your mind becomes quiet and peaceful. And if you've managed to do that at any time in your life, you might well remember it because you'll know, oh, I've done that before. I've let go of some anger or some worry or some attachment of some sort or other. Probably the popular word for that is you say you have an insight. I've had an insight. I've let go of some suffering. I realized it was impermanent, not self. And maybe you can do it again. Because you know you've done it before, you can do it again. You know it can be done. So insight, wisdom gives you understanding, gives you more confidence, helps to remove doubt. And you realize, oh, I can do this. I've done this before. I can do it again. And you can apply that same wisdom all over your mental world, emotions, negative emotions. And ultimately, we have to do it with the positive emotions as well, because subtly they can still become a cause for attachment, conceit, views, and still cause suffering. But we work with the more coarse, the real suffering, the harder suffering first. The more you understand your own thoughts as impermanent, as not self, then you realize probably other people's minds are working much the same as mine. So wisdom naturally brings with it compassion. And you might know someone, in your family or your workplace, and you say, oh, they're suffering, they're angry, or they're worried, or they got a lot of addictions or something, obsessed with something. And because you've seen it in your own mind, then you can say, well, they must be suffering too when they fall into their anger, their anxiety, their suffering. So compassion arises. Occasionally, we can maybe even share some of our own wisdom with that person and say, oh, you need to do this. I did this and it worked. Maybe you should try it. Maybe share some of our experience with them. That might help them. Or at the very least, just sympathize with their situation. Even when they're doing something really unskillful that, you also might be quite critical of them, as they would, you don't go and hurt other people or don't do that foolish thing. You might see that, but at the same time, you also sympathize because you realize they're under the influence of negative emotions and they're suffering. The more you understand your own body and mind as impermanent, not self, and that you suffer when you cling to what is not self, the more you understand other people's suffering. Anyone you notice clinging, whatever expression of grasping, clinging there is, you'll notice their suffering. So then that's another way, anger and your own suffering may fade away. When you have compassion for others, it's harder to get angry with them, harder to fear them, harder to get angry with them, because they're exactly the same as you. They're suffering when they follow these negative emotions. It doesn't mean to say you excuse their bad behavior if that's what they're doing. But it's suffering and it's leading to suffering. So you can let go in that sense. You let go of your own personal anger and desire to seek revenge, say if they hurt you, with things like reputation. If someone damages your reputation, that sense of self is triggered, isn't it? Oh, they've said those words about me. But if you've been practicing this insight into impermanence of thoughts, emotions, feelings, you realize that thing we call me that you're saying has been damaged when they said those words about me doesn't exist. It's just thoughts that arise, pass away, feelings. It's not that there's nothing there, but it's the sense of self is the delusion, and you're trying to catch that. When you see it's impermanent, it's not really there. Oh, when they damage your reputation, you realize there's no real me to be damaged. It's still unpleasant, but you don't have to suffer with it. You just know, oh, this is unpleasant. Maybe you realize it's old karma coming back to you. They call you names and it's like, it's unpleasant to hear, isn't it? But it's just names and there's no one here. There's no one home. So I don't have to suffer with it. As the Buddha said, when they call you names or they criticize you, whether it's true, whether it's not, is one issue. But when they do this, they damage your reputation, they hurt your feelings. You have to reflect. You're just the same as the earth. Going back to the four primary elements, you're the same as the earth. They pour perfume onto the earth. The earth is unshakable, unmoving, it's equanimous, peaceful. Or they pour horrible rubbish or urine or excrement onto the earth. The earth remains unmoving. Make your mind like that. Just like Venerable Sariputta being scolded by the Brahmin who was a bit jealous of him and was looking for an excuse to damage his reputation. So he made up a story. Oh, Venerable Sariputta walked past him and his robe, our robes are very thin and they're not really lethal weapons, but the Brahmin was looking for an excuse out of jealousy to get Sariputta. So he said, oh, Sariputta walked past me and his robe brushed on me. It almost broke my neck. Was he trying to murder me or what? Build up a big drama out of nothing. He didn't do his vipassana, didn't see these thoughts leading to proliferation, leading to the sense of self, leading to indignity and conceit and arrogance arising. Didn't see any of that. He just fell into his own view that Sariputta is trying to hurt him. Sariputta needs to be taken down a peg or two. So he complained to the Buddha, said, oh, Sariputta's robe, he almost killed me. The Buddha is the Buddha is equanimous as well. But, if it had been you or me, we'd probably be rolling our eyes saying, oh, here he comes again. The Buddha wouldn't do that. The Buddha is equanimous. He goes, oh, so Brahmin, what happened? Oh, Sariputta, his robe brushed against me. the Sariputta is so arrogant. He has such a strong sense of self. That's a Buddhist put down, isn't it? Oh, that person has a lot of self, big ego. That's a real Buddhist put down. So use that one. And the Buddha called Sariputta over and said, I'll explain to everyone. And the monks were so excited. They wanted to hear Sariputta explain that he didn't attach to his ego. They called each other around. They said, oh, Sariputta is going to explain to the Brahmin how he didn't act out of anger or ego. Come and listen. Because in those days, that was like Buddhist entertainment. It's like hearing an arahant explain their mind. It's like, oh, the highest thing you could hear, the most Dharma entertaining kind of thing you could hear. So they all gathered round and said, let's hear Sariputta say what he has to say. Sariputta says, oh, my mind is like the earth. I have no attachment to ego, self, no conceit. My mind is peaceful, pure. I didn't act out of spite or ego against this Brahmin. It's just a mishap, which happens if you live together, a lot of monks. Occasionally your robes brush against each other. Maybe it's just the wind sometimes. So the Brahmin was exposed as a bit of a, over-exaggerating. Sariputta declares his purity, his mind is unmoving like the earth, and everyone rejoices in the Dhamma. This is an arahant speaking, so they're happy, explaining what a mind without ego is like. So this is the goal of the practice. We may not be able to achieve it yet, but we have to go little by little in that direction, letting go of self in the body, the material world, our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions, everything that we take as self. You have to question that. Maybe it's not what you think. And that kind of questioning leads to wisdom, leads to liberation, leads to peace. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections here, and in a moment there'll be a chance if you want to ask some questions. We can try to answer them.
Handamayang Dhammakataya Sadhu Karang Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami